Many foreign reports indicate that Israel is behind some of the explosions, and one even suggests that Israel is speeding up the attacks before the U.S. election in November out of concern that President Donald Trump might lose to his Democratic opponent, Joe Biden. And we have our correspondent Yotam Confino with us live from Tel Aviv to break down the story. So Yotam, it's no secret that Israel and the U.S. are very much on the same page when it comes to Iran. What do you make of this report indicating that Israel is speeding up attacks before the U.S. elections in November?
If Israel is indeed behind these attacks, it's very plausible that they have this window of opportunity with 6 months where Trump is going to be in the White House, and they're taking advantage of it. Because if you have a friend, so to say, in the White House that basically gives you carte blanche to do whatever you want, more or less, when it comes to Iran, why not take advantage? So it's very, very plausible that Israel is indeed doing this.
Now, let's say that Joe Biden wins the elections. Will Israel change its policy when it comes to Iran?
I think they'll have to be forced to change their policy, really, because Joe Biden was the vice president under Barack Obama. And Barack Obama signed a deal with Iran, and obviously Joe Biden is a staunch supporter of this deal, and he will most likely try and renegotiate with the Iranians. And if he does so, Israel will have to simply just comply. They can't go on rogue missions in Iran and blowing up all kinds of things if the United States and Iran are actually negotiating.
So there is a window of opportunity now, right? Basically, to what extent do you think that Trump, is going to support Israel if it escalates its attacks against Iran?
It really depends on a lot of things. First of all, Trump is right now campaigning in the United States, so there is a domestic aspect to this. But really, if Iran starts firing missiles maybe at Israel or is launching cyber attacks, the United States with Trump as the leader will most likely back Israel to the fullest extent. In fact, his former national security advisor, John Bolton, in his book, said that Trump allegedly gave Netanyahu a full green light to do whatever he wants, basically with Iran.
Now, Iran's reaction to the killing of Soleimani was fairly weak. Obviously, there was a huge expectation that we were going to see a massive retaliation here. What has the impact of that weaker response been in terms of Israeli policy with Iran or against Iran?
It was a very, very interesting period when Soleimani was killed. In the days after Israel was really holding its breath here, Netanyahu instructed everyone to keep mum, to not say a word about this, because they didn't know how Iran would react to this. This was a very, very aggressive move, and at the end of the day, it could have escalated. But given that it didn't, I think Israel really learned their lesson from this. They saw that sometimes Iran is bluffing, and you can really get away with doing things that are very, very aggressive towards Iran. So I think that this really taught them a lesson, and this is maybe why they're behind these explosions now.
All right, Yotam, thank you so much for joining us with that insight. Iran still hasn't published its findings from investigations into some of these explosions, and they've only hinted through anonymous sources that Israel might be behind this. The question is, what will Iran do if it turns out that Israel is indeed behind these attacks? Well, with us live from Washington, D.C. to break down the Iranian side of the story, we have diplomatic correspondent for The Independent, Negar Mortazavi. So, Negar, tell us, why is Iran still hesitant when it comes to officially blaming Israel for some of these attacks?
Well, Iran doesn't have many options when it comes to retaliation, or at least a form of retaliation, as your colleague was also saying. I very much also think that this is some of the hawks, both in Israel and also in Washington, basically thinking that their time is running out as far as a Trump presidency and trying to escalate the situation with Iran. But then at the same time, Iran is not interested in a full-on war with the U.S., is not trying to go down the path of actually being hit on its soil with by the United States. So I think acknowledging the fact that who these attacks are and being very transparent about it will actually push them more into a path of retaliation, which seems to be something that they're trying to avoid, or at least the format of it is unknown. It might be more covert, more through proxies in a way that they can have deniability over it, while also showing some form of force to basically not let this go on for a very long time and in a more harsh format.
So if Iran finds out that Israel is indeed behind some of these attacks, what kind of retaliation can we actually expect?
I don't think the retaliation is going to be something. I think the Iranians are trying, or at least so far have been trying, to be careful and for the next few months to not get into that kind of a bigger conflict or let this escalate out of hand, which will obviously pull in the United States into it. But I think possibly some forms of retaliation, like the incidents we saw last summer with maybe not directly Israel, but some of U.S. allies. We saw the Saudi Aramco attacks, or maybe some assassinations or through proxies. I think there will be some show of force, but nothing that would escalate the situation out of hand in the last few months that President Trump.
What do you think is going to happen if Trump is reelected and Iran faces 4 more years of heavy pressure and sanctions? Are they going to cave? Are they going to cave and, renegotiate a new deal with Washington at the end of the day?
Well, the moderates are very much waiting for a Biden presidency. As your colleague was saying, he was Vice President Obama, and there's a very high chance that he would re-engage with Iran, go down the diplomatic path. If President Trump stays, I don't think the Iranians are ready to negotiate under this form of maximum pressure, unless President Trump also shifts gears, maybe lifts some of the pressure, and basically try to meet them somewhere halfway, more for more, make some concessions, which he has signaled to in the past, but maybe not with Secretary Pompeo in office, because he's even more hawkish when it comes to Iran than President Trump. So if no shift in policy happens in Washington, I don't think Tehran will change course. But if something happens under a Biden or Trump presidency, the Iranians might also change their policy as far as negotiation.
All right, Negar Mortazavi, thank you so much for joining us.